Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to Experiential Spirituality, episode 34, Disempowering Evil. As usual, you can find a link to my Twitter account while I still have it through a link in the description box below. You can ask me anything through Curious Cat through a link in the description box below, and you can find my book through a link in the description box below. So I guess I'll begin by telling you the conclusion of the Cat Saga, because for anyone who didn't see last week's episode, I had a cat with me, this cat that kept showing up to my door, and I wasn't sure if anyone owned it, so it kept showing up, and I thought, well, maybe it's a stray, maybe it's not being fed at all. So I let it in, I started feeding it, I showed a video of that, and then I put a post on Facebook just to ask around locally if anyone was missing a cat, and someone got into contact with me saying it was their cat. And so, as I said I would last week, that very night she came round, because she used to live across the road from me. That's how the cat knows the neighbourhood. She came round and took the cat. Now, as I said last week, I don't have any room in my life for a pet on a long-term basis, because I like my own freedom, I like my own space, and most importantly, next year I'll be away a lot, working, doing research essentially for my next book. But I've got to say, when the cat was gone, this place felt very empty. It felt very hollow. And I went through to the kitchen, and its little bowls were there, and I felt kind of sad inside. I felt sadness arise inside me. And then I went to sleep, and I was woken up at 3:30 in the morning by a scratch at the front door, and I knew immediately that it was the cat. And I was like, yes! Cat's back. But what had happened is I got a message from the girl the next morning. She had been meaning to keep it in for a few days, but it had managed to escape and it had made its way straight back to my place. So I let it in, we had a nice sleep here, and we had sausages for breakfast. And then, this time, I took the cat down to her because I now knew where she lived now. Of course, I don't have a cat box, so I had to physically carry it down. And I felt like such a traitor, because the issue is that this girl recently got a kitten, and this cat does not like the new kitten, so it has to spend time with the kitten to get used to it. And I was carrying the cat down, and it was perfectly fine in my arms. It wasn't struggling at all. And if any of you know cats, you know what a miracle that is. Usually if you're carrying a cat, especially if you're carrying a cat outside, they'll try and struggle and get away. But the only time it started struggling was when we approached her proper home, because she knew she was about to go and meet that kitten again. And I felt like such a traitor handing her over. Likewise, obviously, I had to stop feeding the cat. I had to stop giving it attention, otherwise it will keep coming here instead of learning where its proper home is. And that made me feel terrible as well. I felt like Judas there. Every time the cat is at my front door, I have to completely ignore it. Have to ignore it crying, ignore it scratching and everything, which is what you have to do. And I've been doing that, and it hasn't been around for a while. But yeah, that didn't. Even though I have no space in my life for a pet, and the cat isn't by rights mine, it belongs to someone else, it still doesn't feel good doing that kind of thing. And I need to explain something about my own history with cats. First thing, no one really has a chance with in competing with me for a cat's affections, because I grew up with many different cats. The reason is that my mum and stepdad not only had cats themselves, but they always took in stray cats. Cats would sometimes show up and they had been mistreated or they'd been wounded or something, and my mum and stepdad would take them in. So I grew up with an awful lot of cats. I know how to behave around cats, and cats are just naturally comfortable around me. And so it's very difficult for anyone to compete with me for a cat's affections, because they naturally really like me. I mean, I'm a huge animal lover in the first place. If there's one thing I truly despise, it's animal cruelty. But I have a special affinity for cats, and so yeah, that played a big part in the cat drama. But hopefully that cat drama is over with now, and we can put it all behind us. But on the subject of cats, I have written a poem. Last week, I talked about flash fiction and poetry, how I really feel like I'm in the mood, the right spirit, the right mode to write some poetry and to write some flash fiction, which, as I said last week, is any narrative of prose beneath 1,000 words. And I didn't even notice that. And Eurocraft says not even chat, it's literally French for cat, because Tate had said, "Hello David and all souls in the cat." Didn't even notice that, because my brain is just used to reading Tate C, "Hello David and all souls in the chat." So I wrote a poem, but as I said last week, despite the fact that I'm a voracious reader, I read an awful lot and literature is my strength, I feel sometimes kind of childlike when it comes to poetry. I feel like something of a Neanderthal, something of an oaf, because the simple fact is, I like poetry that rhymes. I appreciate poetry that doesn't rhyme. I get poetry that doesn't rhyme, but my preference is for poetry that rhymes. Now, I said last week that I was in the mood to write a dark winter tale, something sinister. And what I actually started writing was a poem about the cat Seath, the phantom cats that I often talk about on this channel. But it turned out, the way that poem turned out in the end, it does have that kind of sinister, eerie vibe, especially towards the end. So I'm going to read you this poem that I wrote. It's divided into 3 passages, if that's what they're called in poetry. I don't know. It's divided into 3 passages with 16 verses each, making for a total of 48 verses. And I must emphasize, first of all, that this is the first draft of the poem. I'm happy enough with it to read it to you, but it's by no means finished. It needs some polish. It needs some a bit more sophistication to it. But ultimately, this is, and I must emphasize this also, this is not a sophisticated poem, and I recognize that it's not a sophisticated poem. It's a very straightforward and matter-of-fact and to-the-point poem. It's about the cat Seath, and more specifically about the cat Seath, these phantom cats, and their history concerning Caithness. So I'm going to read this poem, and I'm very interested in hearing your opinion, because again, I suspect I have a very childlike mentality when it comes to poetry, because I just like poetry that's very simple, straightforward, poetry that rhymes, and poetry that is clear and to the point, and this poem is nothing if not that. So I'm going to begin my poetry reading now, and I'm not going to put my poem on screen, even though I've got it written in a Word document here, because I don't want anyone to read ahead. I think poems are best enjoyed as an oral form of expression. Eurocraft says, "I'll set my expectations to Vogon." Okay, so here's the poem. 1,000 years ago, the Norsemen found this mist-shrouded land of river and mound. It was home to a people of bronze and woad, their realm untouched by the Roman road. We call them Picts in the present day, but they remain mysterious in every way. And among this tribe there was a curious thing, a love of felines and the luck they bring. And in that land lynx did roam, chief among cats in their rugged home. Their skin for pelts these Picts would take, and a ferocious helm their heads did make. Those Norsemen gazed upon this land, its people, hills, soil and sand. They called it Caithness after those folk that venerated felines beneath mystic smoke. Time went by and Caithness became a home and a battleground for peoples of fame. The Caithness of the Norse became the Caithness of the Scot, but the Picts and the Gaels none forgot. The mighty lynx, once worshipped and feared, was hunted to extinction and all their dens cleared. Yet across the land wild cats still stalked, and of supernatural felines the people talked. They called them Cat Seath, fairy cats, but nobody knew if they were phantoms or witches or something anew. They are black with white chests, the people said. They steal the souls from the newly dead. Should you encounter one, you had best run and hide, for ill fortune shall stalk you from every side. Tim Taldrum and Tom Tildrum were among their kings, but the demonic big ears a grim ritual brings. But those days have gone, and most have forgot those fearful old stories once recounted a lot. In Caithness now the only felines most see are their domestic cats and those roaming free? And why consider lynx, phantom, or witch, when we have every comfort at the flick of a switch? Yet many farmers tell stories of fright, of livestock and deer slaughtered by night. Killed by giant felines, those farmers will say, seen in the darkness, and sometimes the day. And some of us recall those tales of yore, tales of old Tom and other such lore. We also know of secret things that may be seen in the wild when no bird sings. So should you wonder this haunted place, fear the cat seath and the fairy race. So that's the poem as it is now. And see, that's the kind of poem I like, but the kind of poem I suspect is very simplistic in terms of poetry, because a lot of poetry deals in implication and nuance, and there's really none of that in that poem. It's a very matter-of-fact poem. But what I like about it, first of all, is that it rhymes all the way through. And second of all, is that that poem expresses everything about the history of the Cat Seath. There is nothing left out about the legends of the Cat Seath in that poem. So not only does the poem rhyme, and I hope it flows okay, it kind of teaches something. It explains something, and I think it does an okay job of it. There's some verses that I don't like, and I took some, what would you call it, a poetic license, I guess, like in these verses where I say, they called it Catness after those folk that venerated felines beneath mystic smoke. Now, I have no idea if the Picts that once lived here in Caithness ever had some kind of ritual where they had smoke and they venerated cats beneath it, but it sounds right, it fits the theme. So yes, I did take some dramatic license at certain points in the poem. There are some parts of the poem that I don't think read well. Like, there are some parts of it that I think are particularly strong. Like, I really like the lines, "It was home to a people of bronze and woad, their realm untouched by the Roman road," because that implies something greater. It implies a greater world outside of what we're talking about. This line, the following verses are weak, I think. "We call them Picts in the present day, but they remain mysterious in every way." It's fine, but I think those are weak verses. And among this tribe there was a curious thing, a love of felines and the luck they bring. We don't know if the Picts ever thought that the cats brought luck, so that's more of a reference to modern day thought. So that's the poem. I'm pleased with it so far. It's just not finished yet, and if you have any opinions about it one way or the other, then please do let me know, because again, it's very hard for me to judge poetry on some kind of level of quality. I only know what I like, and I've basically just written what I like. Don't get me wrong though, I know for a fact I could easily write some really obscure poetry that would be considered sophisticated, but I just felt like writing a very simple, straightforward poem about the Cat Seath, and that's exactly what I did. And even though I only wanted to write a poem expressing facts about the Cat Seath as I did, and their history with this county of Caithness, because it got the way it did towards the end, where I start saying, and some of us recall those tales of yore, tales of old Tom and other such lore. We also know of secret things that may be seen in the wild when no bird sings. So should you wonder this haunted place, fear the Cat Seath and the fairy race. And I realised, this poem, it could also serve as the winter horror poem that I wanted to write. So again, first draft, I'm going to go back, make it a bit more sophisticated in places, make some lines flow better, but yeah, I like that poem. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to tell you. I like what I did there. But one thing that I've thought about a lot, especially recently writing that poem, is I wonder what the line is between a poem and a song. Because as far as I can tell, poems are just the original version of songs, if you like. Songs are basically just poems set to music. The only thing that might distinguish them is the chorus, because I don't know of any poems off the top of my head that have a chorus in the way that songs do, but there's bound to be some. Neurocraft says, I imagined it as a children's book. You know, that's exactly what I thought of it, what I think of it. It's like one of those poems you read to children, you know, perhaps late at night as a, not, yeah, something to frighten them, but not in a sinister, you know, a malevolent way. Just a creepy story for children, and that's kind of the vibe I was going for. But again, that probably makes it come across as childish, but that's just what I wanted to write. But yeah, it did remind me. See, it kind of changes because it kind of begins as a historical account, which in truth it is, and then it becomes more about more creepy, I guess. Because the idea is that the poem is divided into 3 passages, and again, I don't know if they're called passages in poetry. I'll get onto that in a minute. And so the idea was that the first passage dealt with the origins of Caithness's association with cats. The second passage dealt with the Middle Ages conception of cats and these legends about the cat's teeth. And then the third passage would take place in the modern day, as it does. And that's what the poem is. So maybe it's okay if it develops in the way that it does. Tate says, the poem could be engraved on a timber bench on one of the local walks or scribbled on the wall of a bathroom stall in your local pub. That makes it sound bad. Another thing that made me uncertain about that poem is the fact that it came to me so easily. I didn't struggle with that poem at all. Like every time I sat down to write a passage of that poem, I had it done in like an hour. So that made me think, well, I haven't really grafted over this poem. So either means that it's a terrible poem, or I'm some kind of genius, and that poetry comes naturally to me. I would naturally err towards the former. But when it comes to, you know, the way poems are divided, and I don't know what you call passages in a poem, but I said something on Twitter a few days ago, and it's absolutely true. I've never mentioned it before. Where is it? I said, fun fact, despite literature being my strength, being a voracious reader and having written a book, I still have no idea what nouns, verbs and things like that are, nor do I care. That kind of technical knowledge isn't strictly necessary if you intuitively understand something. And that's true. I know what noun. To be fair, I do know what nouns are, though I'd have to think about it for a second. But I don't know what verbs and all the rest are. In fact, when I was in school, I remember struggling to remember what those things were, and it's just something I never really picked up, and it's knowledge that I never absorbed. But it's never stopped me writing well. And so when it comes to poetry, see, as I said in that tweet, you don't need that kind of technical knowledge if you're intuitive at something. And when it comes to poetry, I intentionally didn't look up how to structure a poem or the different ways you could structure a poem, because in the case of poetry, I actually felt that trying to learn how to write poetry in such a technical manner would ruin the poem. That's just, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's just how I feel. You know, I'm not an academic who's trying to break down poems to understand them and to teach poetry. I'm someone who's trying to write poetry, and I genuinely, I could be wrong, but I genuinely suspect it would be detrimental if I got so focused on the technical aspects of the poem. Tate says, inspiring and educational to the locals of your county. I would hope so. I'm going to send it to my driving instructor later on because of course I talk to her about these things all the time. So that's the poem. I'm very happy with it. And just to say a bit more about flash fiction, because when I've done this poem, as I said, I want to write some poetry, write some flash fiction. Now, when I finish that poem, I'm going to try my hand at some flash fiction. And flash fiction, as I said last week, is a narrative of prose that is typically understood to be less than 1,000 words. Some definitions have it be less than 1,500 words. I'll try and keep mine under 1,000. And what I didn't say, I didn't give an example of the most famous instance of what is considered flash fiction. And it's such a cited example that it's almost a cliche now, because if you look up flash fiction, I guarantee you'll see this example cited. So the example is Ernest Hemingway's famous 6-word story. And it really is genius. You know, sometimes I think things are called genius and I think to myself, oh, I don't think that's genius or even particularly clever. But this 6-line story of Ernest Hemingway is very clever, and it really illustrates the strength of flash fiction, the fact that in flash fiction every word counts, and the strength of flash fiction is quite often more about what it implies than what it actually says. So Ernest Hemingway's 6-word poem is this: for sale, baby shoes, not worn. Or for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Kind of the same thing, but I think never worn is the more technically correct. See, that's a great story. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. The reason that's such a genius story, just in 6 words, is that it implies so much. It evokes so many potentialities in the mind of the reader. There are all kinds of scenarios you can imagine from reading those 6 words. You know, why were the baby shoes bought? Why were they never worn? And that's really the looming question from that piece of flash fiction, is why were the baby shoes bought but never worn? Did the baby die? Were they somehow the wrong size? Was the baby born with some kind of deformity that prevented that? That's, again, the strength of it. It implies so much, it suggests so much. And as I often say, and I usually say this in the context of speaking about answering questions, and to use a pop culture example, like the first Highlander film, you have this mysterious group of immortals, and they have to fight down through the centuries, and they can only kill one another by beheading one another. And when they do that, the power of the beheaded one transfers to the one that beheaded them. And they have to fight down through the ages until only one remains. Now that's a fantastic premise. Fantastic. And the reason Highlander 2 didn't work, really, whether people recognise it or not. Now, you can point to all kinds of flaws in that film, but the true crime of that film, the true problem with that film, is that it sought to explain the origin of the immortals. Now, the explanation they gave was stupid in the first place. You know, whether they're aliens or time travelers, the explanation is less important than the fact that they tried to give an explanation. Because, as I even say in this book, obviously in a different context, the mystery is always going to be far greater than any answer you can possibly provide. That's why in so many cases in cinema and in written fiction, there are some questions that should just never be answered. And in the case of Highlander, you should never answer what the immortals are or where they came from, because the mystery, that question, is always going to be far more interesting than any answer you can give. To give a better known example in terms of pop culture, the jockey from the first Alien film. You know, they land on that planet, and you've got the space jockey, and Kane ends up falling amongst some some eggs, and then he gets a face hugger on his face, and that's how the alien comes about. It was a terrible mistake for Ridley Scott to go and try and explain what the space jockey was, because the mystery surrounding that space jockey is just far more interesting than any answer anyone could give. And so that's something to keep in mind when it comes to flash fiction as well. The implication of such flash fiction works so well because it invites the reader's imagination to dream or to conjure up possibilities. If Ernest Hemingway's 6-word story had contained another 4 words that gave you the answer, it would be a far less satisfying story, basically. And maybe I went on a bit of a tangent about that, but it's something that I think about because I think it's a very, very important thing. So remaining with literature for a little while longer, the book that I ordered arrived, Robert E. Howard, The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane. I had to order this. Well, I ordered it from Amazon, but it had to be sent from Florida because, you know, if I'd ordered one of the Conan collections, it would have been sent from the UK because Conan is so popular worldwide that you're going to get it relatively locally. But, you know, the other Robert E. Howard characters like Solomon Kane, Cull of Atlantis, and characters like that, they're not so well known. So when you live in the UK as I do, if you order such a book, you're probably going to have it sent from America, as this was, sent from Florida. But it arrived and it's a really nice collection. Now, there's a little debate about such compilations because, again, for those of you who don't know, Robert E. Howard was a pulp fiction writer in the 1930s, and his stories were written primarily for a pulp magazine called Weird Tales, and collections like this assemble them together. And it's important when you're buying works by Robert E. Howard that they actually are by Robert E. Howard, that a later author hasn't added or tampered with his works, as did happen over the last century. But no, this is Robert E. Howard's genuine Solomon Kane stories here. A debate that I'm not even sure about is how do you order the stories? There's typically two ways of doing it. You either order them chronologically in terms of the character. So you have, in the case of Conan collections, you have Conan's, young Conan, and then the stories progress to older Conan, or you order them in the way that Robert E. Howard wrote them. And the recent trend, as in this book, has been to order them in the way that Robert E. Howard actually wrote them, which means that you're jumping back and forth in like Solomon Kane's life. I don't know which I prefer. To be honest, I think I have a liking for the other method. I'd like the stories to be laid out chronologically for the sake of the character. I've had the Conan stories in so many forms, but I've only had the Conan stories in one form where they were ordered in terms of their chronology, and I think I really preferred that. But I do understand why others might like the alternative, because they want to read these stories in the same order that people back in the 1930s would have read them if they were following Robert E. Howard, so I get that. Now, one more thing I want to say about this book, and it's a beautiful book, by the way. By all accounts, it's the best collection of Solomon Kane stories you can get. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Razor Fist here on YouTube. He's a fan of Solomon Kane as well, and I remember years ago he made a video about Solomon Kane, and he recommended a book, and it was this very book. Another thing about this book is that it's fully illustrated throughout, and most people would automatically see that as a good thing, especially since it's illustrated by someone who essentially came to define how Robert E. Howard's characters would be, or at least Solomon Kane would be seen in fiction. There's lots of illustrations there. Yeah, illustrated by Gary Gianni. So the illustrations themselves are great, no doubt about that. Really lovely artwork. But the problem I have with illustrations, not just in this book, but in any book, is that I don't like my imagination being fed like that when I'm reading a book. If I'm reading a book, I want my own imagination to be free to picture what's going on, rather than it being pushed in different directions by the illustrations on the page. That's just my personal feeling. But at the same time, I have difficulty, maybe it's just Robert E. Howard, but when I'm reading some of Robert E. Howard's stories, I have difficulty picturing certain things, especially when it comes to epic scenes. Because since he was writing in the 1930s, Robert E. Howard uses some kind of archaic words, and I'm sometimes not sure what those words mean. So when he's describing like a big epic scene, my mind can't quite picture it. So when you have a book like this, where the illustrator just shows you the scene, while in other cases I don't like my imagination being pushed in that direction, I actually do appreciate it when I can't visualize it myself. So I just look at the picture and go, all right, I get what's going on now. So really great collection here. I'm about halfway through so far, but I'm not rushing. I'm savouring every story, and I'm really enjoying it so far. For anyone who doesn't know, Solomon Kane, whereas Conan is a barbarian character that existed after the destruction of Atlantis but before our current era, Solomon Kane is a Puritan avenger that lives in our era. He lived at the same time as Sir Francis Drake, and we know that because there's actually a poem in here where he goes to murder Sir Francis Drake for killing other people, but then he finds Sir Francis Drake grieving over the fact that he had to kill those other people, and he leaves him alone, doesn't kill him. So yeah, I think that's all the literature conversation I've got just now. Moving on to more pop culture. I was really looking forward to the release of Sylvester Stallone's director's cut of Rocky 4. I like the Rocky films and I like Rocky 4, and that came out on Friday, and I knew that it was coming out in certain cinemas on Thursday in the United States, and it did, but then it was getting a digital release the next day. What I didn't expect is that we in the United Kingdom wouldn't get it. So if you look on the Amazon Prime USA, you'll find the Rocky vs. Drago, the Ultimate Director's Cut. But if you look on the UK one, you won't find it. So I've been unable to watch that thing that I was looking forward to. Of course, I have a list of unofficial sites. When legal means fail me, I do have access to certain unofficial sites where I can watch such content, but those sites do not yet have that content for whatever reason. They seem to be getting slower and slower at it, but hopefully soon, because I'm really looking forward to that. By all accounts, this recut has apparently split Rocky 4 fans. Some say the theatrical cut is superior, others say this is how the film was meant to be, and I can tell already it's ultimately going to depend on what you want, because the strength of Rocky 4 amongst the Rocky films is that it was like a music video. It's like an MTV music video, just montage after montage, and you've got this bombastic fight between Rocky and Ivan Drago. That was its strength. So if that's what you like about Rocky 4, then this new cut that adds 40 minutes of footage that slows the pace of the film down, well, yeah, it's probably not going to be to your liking. But as a film buff, as someone who likes to kind of analyze film and who likes to know how films are made, I just want to see what footage was cut from Rocky 4. I want to see the kind of film it could be. That's why I'm really looking forward to seeing it. So, as I've been doing for the last few weeks, I'm going to move on to talk about the next David Bowie album in his catalogue, and this one's a special one for me. This week it's 1974's Diamond Dogs, and the reason it's a special Bowie album for me is that it's the first Bowie album I ever owned, and that's a hell of a Bowie album to introduce a teenager to, as I was at the time. I was familiar with Bowie already because, as I explained some time ago, as a kid I wasn't really interested in music that much, but I saw Highlander and I loved the film Highlander, but of course Queen did the soundtrack for Highlander, and the opening song, Princes of the Universe, that just blew me away. So I got into Queen and I started listening to Queen. Highlander was my introduction to Queen. And listening to Queen, specifically Queen's Greatest Hits Volume 2, there's on that album is Under Pressure, which is a song that Queen did with David Bowie. So listening to Under Pressure introduced me to David Bowie. And, I liked Queen. Queen were great, but Bowie just blew me away. It blew my mind as a kid. So my mum found out I was into Bowie, or at least what little I'd heard of Bowie at the time, and she bought me David Bowie's Diamond Dogs. Now, my mum doesn't know anything about David Bowie. I guess she went into a shop somewhere, saw that David Bowie record at random and just chose it at random, but it was a good pick because Diamond Dogs is one of David Bowie's best known albums. It's from his so-called Plastic Soul era, and this whole album, it's almost a concept album. It lays out a vision of a dystopian future, and this album spoke to me so much in my misguided teenage years. So the two songs I'm going to recommend from the album, by the way, this is the album that contains Rebel Rebel, which almost everyone knows. But as ever, I'm going for the lesser known tracks. I won't always do that, but I am continuing to in this case. So there's a bit of a cheat again with this one, because I'm going to recommend Sweet Thing. Now, Sweet Thing, the song actually goes over 3 tracks, but it is one song called Sweet Thing. The 3 tracks are Sweet Thing, The Candidate, and Sweet Thing Reprise. So in the description box, I've linked to that song in the form of one track. So it's those three tracks that have been put into one song, so you can listen to it coherently because it is one song, one narrative. And obviously, as a teenager, I had no clue about some of the obscure references that Bowie was making in that song, or on any of the songs in the album, in fact, but somehow the music just spoke to me anyway. You know how music has the ability to transcend the words that are being spoken, transcend the lyrics? Well, that album really just spoke to me somehow. I'd never heard anything like it, and I could never look at Queen again the same way. The way I look at David Bowie and Queen is that Queen are more mainstream, I would say. You know, they have their obscure tracks, they have their deeper tracks, but broadly speaking, Queen are very mainstream. They tended to make pop music and pop rock, crowd pleasers you could call them, you know, and some of them you just get sick of hearing, like We Are the Champions, We Will Rock You, certainly Bohemian Rhapsody. I'm sick to death of those songs because they're so overused. But as great as Queen are, I feel they were very mainstream. Whereas Bowie, even though Bowie is obviously a legend in rock and roll, somehow Bowie felt my own. You know, it felt personal with Bowie, despite how popular he is. It somehow felt like this obscure artist I'd found and I could have to myself, even though it's David Bowie. So David Bowie was just something else, and that always stayed with me, and nothing could ever compare to Bowie. So the first track I'm going to recommend is Sweet Thing. Bowie never did anything like Sweet Thing before or after. There's nothing to compare to it, not just in Bowie's record, but in anyone's catalogue. It's just an amazing, amazing song. I don't know how to describe it. It goes all over the place, but it's brilliant. I love it. I think it's a work of genius, actually, in all honesty. So the next track I'm going to recommend, I was tempted to recommend Rock and Roll With Me, track number 7, but I thought, if I can only recommend 2, and I've already cheated with Sweet Thing, I'm going to go with We Are the Dead, track number 8. It's just, there's not much to say about it. It's just a kind of downbeat, thoughtful track, and I really like it. So that's my Bowie recommendation this week: Sweet Thing and We Are the Dead, the links to which are in the description box below. So to get to more topical subject matter now, you know, I don't want to keep harping on about the vaccine issue and the mandate issue, even the fact that there's a global coup attempt going on right now on behalf of the bankers and so forth. Because as I've said before, I don't like to become a one issue individual. You know, this stream is experiential spirituality, but that's a broad thing, because spirituality is not just, or shouldn't be just, a part of life. It is life itself. So from my perspective, in a stream that's about experiential spirituality, you can talk about anything because spirituality is life. And what I don't want to do is just become a one issue individual, basically. I don't want to constantly, week after week, talk about the vaccine, the mandates, or whatever else. But one thing I've noticed in many areas about myself is that I often fail to recognize that I need to state the obvious. Like, sometimes I'll take things for granted, and so I don't bother saying them because I assume that they're so obvious that everyone must be aware of them. But I've come to realize so often that that's not the case, and I came to realize it this week. I mean, this isn't going to be true of people who watch this stream. I'm speaking more about everyone else here, you know, your average person. There's just some things that seem so obvious that they shouldn't need to be stated. And in this case, it relates to the idea that one should be mandated to have a vaccine in any context. Any context. The reason that is immoral, I mean, there's many reasons, but the core reason I feel is that this is immoral is that, well, quite simply, now I've got to be careful what I say here on YouTube, but look, this is just a fact. Vaccines always carry risks with them, okay? They always have and they always will. There are always going to be individuals who suffer adverse reactions to vaccines. The logic has been that the benefits far outweigh the cons, and so we have gradually as a people accepted the use of vaccines, despite the fact that, again, some can suffer adverse reactions and may even die. You know, it's true of this so-called vaccine. It's true of almost every vaccine. In fact, it is true of every vaccine that I'm aware of, at least. But that's what makes mandating them fundamentally immoral, because when you take a vaccine, you are playing Russian roulette to a degree. And it's fundamentally immoral to force someone to take that kind of gamble with their own lives, especially when you know perfectly well, as has happened already in the last 2 years, that if someone is coerced or forced or bullied into having a vaccine and they do suffer an adverse reaction or even die, the people who forced them or coerced them or bullied them into doing so, they're going to turn a blind eye and pretend they don't exist. Because as far as they're concerned, it's collateral damage. And that might be fine from their perspective, but that's why it's fundamentally immoral to mandate vaccines for any reason, because you're forcing people, you're coercing people to take a gamble with their health. That's why it's fundamentally immoral. Now, to me, that's the most obvious thing in the world, but apparently it's not to many. And Eurocraft says these Bowie installments could be clipped into an interesting YouTube playlist. You know, there are times where I think I did used to take clips from these live streams and you know, put them as their own videos, and in terms of channel growth, that would probably be a very good idea. But what I found was that they hardly got any views. It seems that most just watch the live streams themselves. And plus, I don't even know if I've got the time anymore. Like, I completely forgot to upload last week's Experiential Spirituality to Rumble and Odyssey. It just completely slipped my mind. Tate says, women had to gain their rights against sexists, people of colour had to gain their rights against racists, and the unvaccinated will have to gain their rights against scientists. You know, on that note, it's amazing how individuals seem to be blind to the spirit that motivates them. Like, individuals now who have gone full authoritarian, who are really trying to, you know, turn the unvaccinated into second-class citizens, they are incapable of seeing how they are the same as those that they would acknowledge as villains of history. They can't see it. They have that blind spot somehow. They feel that they're on the right side of history, and they can't see the clear comparison between them and authoritarians of the past, authoritarians that they themselves would rightly condemn. They just can't see it. But as I said before, this is a big test. This is a big test for everyone. And, you know, I hate to say, I'm going to say, this is the last time I'm going to say this, but just to restate, if someone wants to take the vaccine, that's their business. It doesn't bother me at all. I won't think less of anyone if they take the vaccine. But supporting these mandates and turning the unvaccinated into second-class citizens, no, that's an issue of morality. Then I will have a problem. And Eurocraft says, in the US, the Fifth Circuit recently extended its stay of the federal mandate. Are we the baddies? Yeah, that classic Mitchell and Webb clip. I don't know if you guys in the US are that familiar with Mitchell and Webb. They've done several shows. Most famously, they made a program called Peep Show, which is a hilarious comedy program. I think it's the most clever comedy program ever made, actually. Very, very good. But the most recent project is a sitcom called Back. And because I like Mitchell and Webb so much, I decided to buy the 2 seasons of Back on Amazon Prime and watch them, and it's alright. It's nowhere near as clever as Peep Show. Sometimes it's downright silly, it's a bit slapstick, so not that good, but they're great at what they do anyway, so I got some enjoyment out of it, even though it wasn't that great. Now, the main subject of today's stream is Disempowering Evil. And the reason this is on my mind is simply because of the incident at the concert in the last week. I'm sure you all know what I'm referring to, where this rapper, I think he is, there was basically a stampede and people were dying at his concert. And what happened as a result is that individuals on the right were calling it a satanic sacrifice, essentially. And they were pointing out all kinds of ritual symbolism that this guy had as part of his show and things like that. And that's the worst way to approach such things. I think that's completely misguided and completely wrong. Do artists like that rapper and like Katy Perry, do they use evocative imagery on purpose? The answer is clearly yes. Do they have some genuine occult power? Well, no. See, the point is, this is the irony of it. When these people on the right get hysterical over these things, they're actually playing in to exactly what those artists want. The very reason that those artists will use like all-seeing eyes and all the satanic imagery is to project a certain image of themselves as being edgy. And those individuals on the right who ascribe them with some kind of occult power, they're playing right into their hands. Imagine this. Imagine the goth kid at school, and I'm on thin ice here because to a large degree I was that goth kid. But imagine a goth kid at school. You know, he comes in, he's got, I don't know, maybe a pentacle around his neck or whatever, and he's got his makeup on. I wasn't this kid ever, by the way, but I was on the verge. And he has makeup on, black. Imagine if everyone around that goth kid, because of that imagery, imagine that they took that goth kid as a serious threat. You know, that would be that goth kid's dream come true, because he wants to come across as someone who's dangerous and someone who knows things, has all this occult power. So, you know, they would love it if everyone feared them because of that. But the reality is, of course, he's just a kid going through different changes, and he's trying to find his place in the world. Fundamentally, he's insecure, and of course, he's not strong at all. He can be, and most likely will be, bullied very, very easily. But that's the same thing. It's just an individual or individuals trying to project a certain image. But there's no more reason to take these artists seriously than there is to take that goth kid seriously. And if you do take them seriously, you're doing exactly what they want. You're buying into their attempt to project a certain image of themselves, and worst of all, you give them power over you because you have made yourself afraid of them by ascribing them with powers that they don't have. And that's the other thing. You've got to look at the kind of individuals we're talking about. I used the example of Katy Perry and this rapper earlier. Does anyone really believe that these individuals know about occult power? I mean, let's just say for the sake of argument, which is completely false, but let's just say for the sake of argument that there was some evil occult power to draw from in the first place, which there really isn't. But let's say that there was. Would the likes of Katy Perry or this rapper really, you know, are they sitting there reading grimoires and musty tomes to find a way to harness this occult power? Of course not. They're just using theatrics, and they're using them effectively, and the right wing, certain elements on the right wing, are falling for it. Neurocraft says, so you've basically said you probably don't, quoting Q, so you've basically said you probably don't see it like this, but two different classes of people. If you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, you have all these rights if you're vaccinated. Answer, that's what it is, yep. New Zealand, PA. Oh yes, I saw that clip, yes. Okay, I want to say I acknowledge what Tate says here, but since I'm on YouTube, if I utter it, this channel might be nuked off the face of the earth. But yes, I acknowledge that. And honestly, you know, a lot of those claims sound far-fetched to me, but I'm someone who doesn't have the first clue about that kind of thing, so they could be perfectly true for all I know. Fake it until you make it. Aleister Crowley, probably. Okay, where are we now? So yeah, there are so many evil things in the world that souls are empowering them by taking them seriously when they don't deserve to be taken seriously. And that's just one example of them. But actually, even when it comes to genuine ethereal / supernatural evil, the worst thing you can do is take them seriously, because even they only have power you. Even actual supernatural forces, malevolent supernatural forces, even they only have power over you if you let them have power over you. Now, what I point out in my book when I'm describing ethereal evil is that there are a lot of individuals who have recommended, like if you're confronted with a demon or some kind of malevolent spirit, there are a lot of individuals who have recommended that you laugh at them. that you mock them essentially. And I recommend it against that, because that's a negative expression that will only end up strengthening them. What I recommend is being completely passive in the face of them. Being the undisturbed, at peace spirit that you are, and just letting their manifestations, no matter how horrific it might be, just letting those manifestations wash over you, and you just remain calm as the spirit. That is undoubtedly the best way to deal with supernatural evil, and it's certainly a very effective way, and the best way of dealing with the kind of evil we see in the world as well. You can't do anything about it. It's manifesting in your reality, in your present moment, right before you, but what you can do is just let it wash over you, because it can only harm you, it can only have a negative effect on you if, firstly, you believe that it can, if you don't understand that you're spirit and that you're therefore immune to such things, and if you allow it. Tate says, no grimoires, just resonating on a lower plane of vibration. They certainly are doing that, and there's a great quote in the New Testament, and I don't know about that. I don't know if it probably doesn't have quite to do with this subject, but it's the same idea, which is that the followers of a prophet will have that prophet's reward. Those who are attracted to these really low down artists, like these artists who, as Tate says, are on a lower plane of vibration, well, like attracts like, essentially. They're attracted to those artists because they're on that plane themselves, and they will imitate that artist to some degree. And our culture in the West being what it is now, those artists are unfortunately very prevalent. And I don't have any experience being in the music industry just now, but I have to imagine that just like in literature, it's very hard for those who aren't of that lower vibration to rise to the surface. I have to imagine that's the way it is in the music industry. Sure, you'll get the odd exception, and you'll have those old school artists, like someone like Enya. Enya is the exact opposite of someone at a lower plane of vibration. All of her songs are about the majesty of spirit and things like that. But Enya has been going for decades now. I strongly doubt, while an artist like Enya could arise now, I think an Enya in the modern day would be very obscure. I don't think Enya would be allowed to become as famous as she is if she were to arise in the modern day. I just don't think the industry would allow it. I think that's true in many industries. Visualize yourself surrounded by white light and repeat, nothing in this world can harm me. And the world is actually the point I want to conclude this monologue on disempowering evil on, because this is something that always has to be remembered, is that these evil people in the world, whether we're talking about the conspirators that are waging war against the people right now, waging war against humanity, or any other kind of evil, they are fundamentally blind. They are blind, deaf, and dumb, because given their low level of consciousness, they only acknowledge material realities. As far as they're concerned, if they can just have all the power in the world, all the money in the world, they will have attained to the highest degree possible, because they're ignorant of the spirit. And when you're someone who knows of the spirit, who knows God, it's obvious how short-sighted and ignorant such souls are, and that they're ultimately going to bitterly regret their lack of vision. I have no problem saying, some do have a problem saying this. I have no problem saying this at all. I have no problem saying, like, this soul is going to go to hell. And there's two reasons that I don't have a problem saying that. One is because, as I explain in the book, there's my famous catchphrase, as I explain in the book, you enter into hell while you're still here in mortal form. Because hell is a state of being that you experience here in mortal form, and that you enter into after the death of your physical body if you do not repent and change your ways. So I don't have a problem saying that this or that soul is going to go to hell, because in many cases it's obvious that they're already there. So I know that if their physical form dies, they're going to end up experiencing what I call an ethereal hell, a hellish realm, at least for a period of time, as we count time here in the world. I have no problem with that for that reason, and also because everyone does it. You know, those individuals who complain about saying this or that person is going to go to hell, while they may complain about it, they'll still make exceptions. So, for example, ask them whether they think Hitler and Stalin are in hell. They wouldn't dare say no to that question. They wouldn't dare say no to those questions. So you can expose their hypocrisy very easily. Look, let's not play games. And frankly, I'll be honest with you, I think that this is one of those things that the modern world doesn't want to hear. The modern world doesn't want to be judged. So many souls in the modern world, the thing they fear above all else is judgment. And certainly the last thing they want to hear is that, look, you're on your way to hell. You are plainly on your way to hell. You're going to end up in hell. They don't want to hear that. So that makes me want to say it all the more. Because it's obviously true in many cases. It's true that we are not the judge. And I'll make that clear. We are not the judge. God is the judge. That is absolutely true. But that doesn't change the fact that you can very clearly see someone's state of being. And even though you yourself are not the judge, let's just say you can take a guesstimate at their afterlife destination. Tate quotes Jesus, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Exactly. So, yes, these individuals are very blind, they're very short-sighted, and I think everyone watching this live stream is old enough to know that as you get older, time just escapes you. Like, I can't believe I'm 37 years old, but even in my late 20s, I recognized, hey, time is going really, really fast here. My life is going really, really fast here. And of course, when you're 55, you'll look back and your 55 years will seem like the blink of an eye. And of course, that process continues until you're on your deathbed and you look back on your life and it seems like it passed in an instant. Well, all of these souls, these misguided souls, they're going to reach that point where they've striven for all of their mortal lives for material wealth, material success, and they've realized it's all gone in the blink of an eye, and that's all they had to hold on to. And now they're going to be cast into eternity with nothing, essentially. And that's the fate that awaits them. And that's just a simple reality. But of course, to take any comfort from these kind of realities, to take any consolement in the fact that justice is going to be done, you have to truly know God. You have to truly have experienced the spiritual. Otherwise, everything I've just said is just a belief in your head, which may or may not be true. That's the importance of experiential spirituality. So I'm going to turn to the few questions I have on Curious Cat to conclude this video. Are you familiar with the Legacy of Kane series? Yes, I am, but I've only actually played the second game, which I believe was called Soul Reaver. That was a game I really enjoyed back in the day, but that's really all I know about the series. But I think, and it's possible this question is being asked for a reason, I think that Kane, I think that character was in part inspired by Solomon Kane. There are a lot of characters that have been inspired by Solomon Kane, because just to make clear, in case anyone isn't aware, Robert E. Howard is the grandfather of sword and sorcery. That's how important a figure he is in the history of fiction. And his Conan character, it began that barbarian stereotype. It began that stereotype of the barbarian character that has been repeated and emulated God knows how many times. Likewise, Solomon Kane has been imitated so many times, and I believe, and it's possible the individual is asking that question for this reason, I believe that the character from the Kane series is one of those Solomon Kane imitations. To name some others, this is a very obscure one, but there was a comic book character, I believe he was originally, called Shakan, the Forever Man. but I think he's best known from the Mega Drive / Genesis video game. He was very clearly a Solomon Kane clone. Also, Van Helsing, the character, most famously portrayed in the film, I think, starring Hugh Jackman, that was a Solomon Kane clone. Down through the last century, there has been many Solomon Kane clones because, the grandfather of sword and sorcery, he set the templates up for these character types. But it's good to go back to the source and read the originals. Now, okay, this is the first time I'm going to criticize Robert E. Howard, but I'm not even criticizing Robert E. Howard, actually. There's just a certain thing about these stories, all Robert E. Howard stories, and in fact all stories from this era, is that they're never going to surprise you. They're very, very predictable stories, but that's not a fault with the stories themselves. It's just a result of the fact that, again, when these stories were written, they would have been fresh, they would have been surprising, but because these stories set the standard for fantasy over the next century, followed then, of course, by Tolkien much later on, what the stories that seem so predictable to us now weren't at the time. So it's just because these are the foundational stories that they seem so predictable. But that's strangely enough, that's one of the reasons I enjoy those stories. I don't read Robert E. Howard or any other pulp fiction from the 1930s to be surprised or to experience something new or to read something new. I read those stories to go back and enjoy a good old-fashioned pulp fiction adventure, and that's exactly what I get with Robert E. Howard. Next question is on the same subject. If you're a big fan of Robert E. Howard, what are your thoughts on Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith? Okay, this is going to be a shameful admission, but Clark Ashton Smith is someone whose work I've simply never read. And the reason that's a shameful admission is because Robert E. Howard, Lovecraft, and Smith, they kind of are regarded as the trinity of pulp fiction, essentially, at least of that era. But Smith is just someone I've never read. Lovecraft I've read, and Lovecraft I like. But even then, the only reason I'm familiar with Lovecraft and his work is because Robert E. Howard used to correspond with Lovecraft. They became very good friends, and they corresponded through letters, many of which are available today. You can go on Amazon and buy the letters they exchanged with one another. They talk about all kinds of things. But I began to read the works of Lovecraft because of his association with Robert E. Howard. And even though I prefer Robert E. Howard because I just prefer what he was writing about, I prefer his themes, I really appreciate Lovecraft as well. And I think that Lovecraft, this is just my opinion, I could be wrong, but I feel that Lovecraft only works in written form, written by Lovecraft. Obviously, there's been many films and video games based on the works of Lovecraft, but somehow I think you lose that sense of cosmic horror, that sense of dread, when you take that projection of them from the written word and you try and convey it through a video game or through a movie. I just don't think it can be done right. But again, that's just my personal opinion on the subject. But on the issue of pulp fiction writers, Din Trump on Twitter this week, he showed me a book he'd got by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and he asked me if I'd ever read Edgar Rice Burroughs, another pulp fiction writer. He's most famous, of course, for creating Tarzan and for creating the character of John Carter from Mars. And as I said to Din, I actually bought a collection of Burroughs' Tarzan stories on Amazon, like every Tarzan story, because it was being sold for like 14 pence at the time, and I thought, well, it'd be silly not to pick that up. So I bought it, but I never got around to reading them, and especially now because I've got to be conscious not to strain my eyes. I've always preferred printed books over digital versions, but especially now, I'd probably, if I was to start reading Burroughs, Yeah, or anyone else, in fact, I definitely order a physical copy. As far as I'm concerned, you can't beat sitting down with a nice book. Very nice book. I like it. What are your thoughts on Lord of the Rings? I'm not that huge a fan of Lord of the Rings for reasons that very much come down to personal taste. Because obviously Lord of the Rings is the epic of fantasies. And it's just too epic for me. It's too long-winded for me. I tried to read the first book, the first of Tolkien's books, and I don't know how they were published originally, but when most people think of the Lord of the Rings, they think of it as a trilogy. So you've got the Fellowship of the Ring, you've got the Two Towers, and then you've got the Return of the King. But when I was reading or trying to read these books, they were actually divided into 6 books. So I read the first book, and it ended just after the death of Boromir, which is completely different to how it is in the film, because in the book, Boromir's death scene isn't actually portrayed at all. They actually just find Boromir dead, if I recall correctly. But I found it a slog, frankly, to read Tolkien, because if I recall correctly, like for the first 13 pages of that first Lord of the Rings book, it's just focusing on the Hobbit's party. And I'm sorry, I don't mean disrespect to Tolkien or anyone who likes Tolkien. This is just a personal preference. I cannot make myself care about a Hobbit's party so much that I'm willing to read page after page after page about it. This is part of the reason that I like pulp fiction writers like Robert E. Howard, because 13 pages in a Robert E. Howard story, you've gone all over the place. Loads of things have happened, very fast-paced, and there's a degree to which I'm just not willing to invest my time in fantasy and fiction, because if I start to invest myself in fantasy and fiction too much, I feel like I'm kind of wasting my time, because there are other real world and spiritual matters to focus on. So when I indulge in fantasy or fiction of any kind, I want it to be a good use of my time. That's also part of the reason I'm attracted to writing flash fiction recently. So I don't have a bad thing to say about Tolkien or Lord of the Rings. It's just for me personally, they're far too long-winded, and I'm not willing to invest time in reading so much material at all. And I just didn't find the Lord of the Rings books entertaining to read. I even feel the same way about the films, and I've said it before, and this is blasphemy to many individuals, but I would rather watch Willow than the Fellowship of the Ring. I just would, because Willow, you've got a nice 2-hour solid fantasy film, whereas Fellowship of the Ring, you've got a 3-hour or a 3.5-hour, depending on which version you're watching, I guess, or maybe a 4-hour version. And yeah, I'd rather just watch Willow, in all honesty. But yeah, the films by Peter Jackson, they're exceptionally well made, no doubt about that, well written, which is the same cannot be said about the Hobbit films. But what I really appreciate about Lord of the Rings, and what makes them stand out, the films, what makes them stand out even now, is the perfect way that they used practical effects with digital effects. Because in most cases, you really can't tell in those films. Whereas if you look at like the Hobbit films that came out much later on, they look like video games. Somehow Peter Jackson did a far better job with Lord of the Rings, like a decade earlier. There are silly cinematic moments in it which I'd rather there weren't. Like there's that bit, and I think it's in the Battle for Helm's Deep, where Legolas slides on a shield down some stairs and he's shooting his bow as he does so. That's silly to me. I don't like that kind of Hollywood silliness. I like things to be kept grounded, and I don't think it's even appropriate for Tolkien to do that kind of thing in a film. But they're well-crafted films, great films, and I certainly wish that we could get films of that quality for some Robert E. Howard characters. There was, by the way, a Solomon Kane film made in, I think it was 2009, which is very, very good. Hardly anyone knows about it because it didn't get distribution in the United States until like 3 years after its release over here in Europe. But it's very, very good. I know it's on Amazon Prime now. they did have to shoot, because Hollywood is Hollywood, they did have to shoehorn an origin story for Solomon Kane, just like they did with Conan, even though neither, in Robert E. Howard's stories, Solomon Kane doesn't have an origin story, Conan doesn't have an origin story. They're just there having adventures, whereas Hollywood feels, oh no, if you're introducing these characters to the audience, you've got to give them this origin story. So in both the case of Conan, whichever version of the film you're watching, and Solomon Kane, the origin story is just shoehorned in, and it doesn't even fit the character. But aside from that silly origin story, the film is great. James Purefoy plays Solomon Kane and does a fantastic job of it. I just wish so much there had been sequels. So, finally, what are your thoughts on Jesus' injunctions to not look at women and on not getting angry with others? Well, this is one of those issues that I remember coming up an awful lot when I still considered myself a mainstream Christian. When Jesus said, if you look at a woman with lust, tear your eye out, it was in the context of that individual being married. And that makes sense because how would you ever meet someone of the opposite sex and have a family with them if you weren't allowed to desire them? So it's important to recognize that in the context, Yeshua is speaking about married individuals. Also, he's not speaking about seeing a good-looking person and acknowledging them in your head as being good-looking. What he's talking about is harboring desire for someone when you yourself... What he's talking about is harboring desire for someone when either you are married or that other person is married. That is what is sin. It's not just merely looking at someone and recognizing that they're hot, because otherwise everyone that's married would be condemned. It's harboring the lust for that person. Now, when it comes to this question of anger, this is another issue that used to come up an awful lot, because the thing is that Yeshua seems to conflict with the Apostle Paul on this matter, because the Apostle Paul said, be angry, but do not let the sun go down on your anger. So Yeshua seems to just... Well, it's difficult because when Yeshua condemns anger, he's condemning it in the context specifically of being angry towards your brother. In other words, another Christian, someone animated by the Holy Spirit. And that makes sense because if you know the Gospels at all, if you've even given them a cursory reading, you know that Yeshua was angry all the time. He was angry with lots. He was angry in the Gospel of Mark when a leper came up and requested healing. So Yeshua was all the time. Yeshua was angry all the time. So it would be weird if he was angry all the time and yet condemned ever being angry. So it's important to recognize that when he condemns people for being angry, and when he condemns his disciples for saying "you fool," he specifically, and this is explicit, he's explicitly speaking about them addressing other Christians, other souls animated by the Holy Spirit in that way. That's very, very clear. Again, especially since Yeshua himself was angry all the time. He was mostly angry in the Gospels. So I think that makes sense, and it helps to square what Yeshua said with what the Apostle Paul would later say. Be angry, do not let the sun go down on your anger, and so forth. So I'm going to make a real effort to have these streams be really efficient. I don't, as much as a lot of individuals enjoy them, I don't want those long rambling streams that go on for 3 or 4 hours where I'm just going on all kinds of tangents, going all over the place. So I'm going to end this week's stream here, and I think because I think that'll be a nice efficient stream that had a fast pace and a good momentum and is full of content. So thank you very much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.